Hi, I'm Justin from Assembly Architects, a little practice based on Arrowtown and Arrowtown. I've spent quite a bit of time looking into the variation for intensification into the Queenstown Lakes District Council proposing at the moment, and specifically Arrowtown. I've done quite a bit of background reading about why and how it's come about, and I've got some opinions as to whether I think it's appropriate. So I've put together some information slideshow to kind of explain how it's come about and my thoughts on why it's not appropriate. So why? As we know, New Zealand's got a housing shortage. From 2013 to 18, we had a population growth of close to 11%, but our dwelling stock only increased by 6.5%. So the Reasonable Management Act has been seen as a restraint to housing supply and infrastructure during periods of significant growth, and politically, housing affordability has been one of the main hot topics. In Auckland, when they did the unitary plan, they had an upzoning into that unitary plan, and they saw that after the upzoning, this is what a graph of the residential units that were built. So in 2016, as soon as it was implemented, you can see on the lower graph, the non-upzoned residential areas maintained the status quo, and we saw a significant growth in the number of dwelling units built in Auckland. So this was seen as a model of success in terms of providing additional housing supply. There was a bipartisan introduction of the National Policy Statement on Urban Development. And essentially this was taking the model that's happened in Auckland's upzoning and applying it to urban areas around the country to increase the density and increase the supply. So if you hear the politicians talking in this election, they talk about supply and they talk about the MDS, the medium density zones, as being one of the main successes in providing supply. So that's what's driving it. When you look at the national policy statements, there's some pretty clear wording. The idea of Objective 3 is to enable more people to live in areas with employment opportunities that are well serviced by public transport with high demand for housing, which makes sense. Objective 4 recognises that amenity values develop and change over time in response to the changing needs of people. So how this turns into policy affects how this comes about. So a well-functioning urban environment will meet the different households' needs in terms of type, price, location, and have good accessibility between housing and services, jobs, health, and recreation by active or public transport. Policy 6 is saying when planned built form may involve significant changes to an area, and that change may detract from amenity values of some, but improve amenity values of others, including by providing increased and varied housing densities and types, and the significant changes are not in themselves an adverse effect. So what they're cutting through here is with the RMA, a lot of the stopping of housing supply has been to do with the amenity values of sun and view into residential properties. So this is a significant step change that says that you need to consider not only the negative amenity values that might be on one property, but balance that against the increased amenity values for the people that will use the future development. So, well, one site might lose sunshine if a property develops to provide 5 houses which have the proximity of walking distance and public transport to all the things that you need from your house in terms of recreation, health, education. Then there's an increase in amenity values for those people. So now it's a balance between the negatives and the positives. So again, bringing it back to the NPS, they saw this implementation in 2016, the upzoning. And so this is the graph that the politicians are trying to do. They want increased intensity. So the process that they're going through is there's a way to identify the areas to intensify, and that's looking at what is a well-functioning urban environment in terms of public transport and public and active transport. So once you've identified the areas that have these criteria, then you can then exclude some of them for qualifying matters, and then they need to enable the intensification through district plans. So this is a requirement by central government on all the councils. It's happened in Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch. It's happening in Nelson. It's happening here. It's flowing through. Here's the kind of accessibility model, which makes sense if you live in Arrowtown. Some of the great things about Arrowtown: we've got a main street, the town centre, which has got restaurants and pubs, walk to school, there's shops, we've got a little supermarket, it's got a medical centre. So the house sits within all these kind of 10-minute walk things. So it's a highly accessible and therefore a well-functioning urban environment. So Arrowtown has been identified as an area that does need to intensify because it has all those attributes. And then it goes through the exemption considerations for Arrowtown. So if you're going to be exempt, then you need to demonstrate why it is considered that the area is subject to a qualifying matter, and there is a list of qualifying matters. The impact, then assess the impact that limiting the development capacity, height density, or any other relevant matters will have on the provisions of development capacity. So if an area has been identified as it should intensify, you have to really look at, you can't just say, oh no, let's not do it, but you have to assess the impact of limiting that. So if that's not providing those houses, and then assess the cost and broader impact. So the historic management zone in Arrowtown has been excluded because they see a significant number of heritage features and buildings. There is a historic heritage precinct and the fabric sufficiently intact, essentially with Newtown. And so these are the qualifying matters. Furthermore, they're saying that the proposed changes to the low density and the medium density zones are still allowing for the increased supply, and therefore it's only a small area. So you really have to justify, the councils has to justify why they're going to exclude something. They can't just go, oh, it's excluded, and they've got lots of reports in there around what's going on. There was an assessment of the medium density zone, and in the assessment of the medium density zone, that basically the report says that it's a 1970 subdivision pattern with housings that's not unique to New Zealand. So there's nothing special about the housing that sits in that area of Arrowtown. It's 1970s, lots of it throughout New Zealand. It doesn't qualify to be exempt. And it also makes this note that, well, the key characteristic of low density 1 to 2 story buildings, the NPS is to enable greater density. So hence just the presence of the low density design does not justify preventing the higher density. So it's really, the NPS is really about intensifying, and you have to have really strong reasons why not to. So, Arrowtown character, and this is probably the part where there's some questions about whether the medium density should qualify or not. So there's an objective in the Arrowtown, in the operative district plan, I've got that wrong, is that Arrowtown's medium density development occurs in a manner that's compatible with our town character. It's identified that Arrowtown does have a special character, and so the development, including the housing, has got the form that's compatible with the existing character of Arrowtown, and that's guided by a document called the Arrowtown Design Guides. And it's got particular regard to building, design and form, scale, layout and relationships of building to the street. So character, in the RMA sense, is something that has gone through a long process of trying to understand what does character mean. And in the landscape assessments, in landscape, there's a well-developed understanding of how to do a character assessment. What are the qualities of a landscape that make up and create a specific and unique landscape? So Arrowtown and urban landscapes are landscapes just like green space landscapes, and so there's a process that you should go through to be able to identify what are the unique characteristics that give a specific landscape or town its qualities. So it's identified that we've got special qualities, but what is it about Arrowtown that gives it those special qualities? So the Arrowtown Design Guide is a very robust document that's gone through a lot of history that's assessed Arrowtown. So in there, it's got a bunch of assessment criteria, or attributes, if you like, of what gives us our character. So I've just cut and pasted a bunch of them out, but spaciousness is a key characteristic of Arrowtown. The elements as they combine together, cottage sizes, buildings on large sections, abundant vegetation, low-key rural town, spacious, simple, uncluttered, peaceful, vistas and views to the surrounding hills, and there's a high cohesion amongst the town. So these are all words that you use to describe a character, and so the Arrowtown design guides have got a lot of description about character, which is quite different to the way that it's been characterised in the reports that have been commissioned. We've got a historic built form, so there's been a big analysis around in the document around what were the historic buildings, what was the proportions of them, sizes of them, how are they aggregated together, how does that give us our unique character? So Arrowtown's character is unique from most places in New Zealand because of this. It's different to Auckland and Wellington's Victorian houses. These small cottages and the way that they were aggregated and added over the time is what gives it its character. There's guidance in there about the built form as to the size and scale that's appropriate. And so this is directly for the medium density zones, going up to 5 metres, 4 metres. So these are all small, low-scale buildings. They have to update this document to enable the MDZ if it goes through, MDR. But in the document, it's got some pretty clear statements. It says massive single 3 stories forms are alien to Arrowtown. Yet the zone, building heights will generally be 3 stories. So there's a conflict between upscaling and intensifying to the 3 stories and then what is appropriate to the design for Arrowtown. So there's a distinct conflict in the council's documents. Quite clearly says that 1.5 stories are preferred to 2 stories. And this is the 3 Mare Ridge development on the edge of Arrowtown, and you can see the density of that. And then the design guides to 2023 variation is showing buildings of less density. So this is low density, and we're allowed to go 12 metres. So there is a conflict between the diagrams that have been drawn of appropriate development for Arrowtown within its character and within the design guidelines, but what it's portraying is still predominantly standalone buildings rather than terrace housing and apartments. So what does a medium density typology look like in accordance with the rules, so that we can kind of understand Arrowtown? What visually does that look like? So we've done quite a lot of designs in Arrowtown, and this is the vernacular, which is to take these cottage shaped forms, lean-to shed forms, and you aggregate them together, articulate them with different materials. The Wiltshire project that Roaster's in is a good example, where we have the stone cottage, galvanised, and the Corten steel. They're all their own independent forms that read quite clearly, but that aggregate of them gives it a real unique Arrowtown feel. So trying to apply that to this typology of this height, I've taken the same proportions of the area of the building, so the footprint, the width, the length, but I've lifted up those cottage forms to the 12-metre heights. I've looked at a development on a single site in Kent Street, and then if you were to aggregate 2 to see what you could get as a mass for those sites. So it's highly intensive. I've then had a look at how that medium density typology would sit on Kent Street. Now Kent Street is, I've chosen Kent Street because Kent Street is the division between the historic zone, which is the pink and the orange zone. So it's where this kind of compatibility is probably the most acute question, where you've got a specific historic character on one side, but that proximity of this intensity, how does that affect the character? We can then put that typology into Kent Street with the modelling, and we have existing Kent Street and then Kent Street developed. Existing Kent Street and Kent Street developed. So it's a significant change, the height and mass of these buildings along the edge of Kent Street. And if we look at the character values or effects, where we used to have cottage-sized buildings on large sections with abundant vegetation and low-key rural town residential character, spacious, simple, uncluttered, peaceful, are no longer qualities that you see in the medium density zone. And so what we're losing is there's a cohesion that exists between the historic town and the medium density area. So while the medium density area currently is a 70s subdivision with primarily single-story buildings, it still has the abundance of trees growing through it. The scale of the buildings is similar to the cottage scale of buildings, and that cohesion between what's in the medium density zone and the historic zone is quite high. So while it doesn't have the old parts, it is complementing the new parts. So essentially that's a rundown on the why it's being done and why I don't think it's appropriate. I think it affects Arrowtown's character.